Here we go. Ready? Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend Kylie Symonds. Symonds. For those who can't get out, or rather just stay home, hopefully these videos will let you out for a while. She has some really pretty streamy videos, outdoors, water, other really cool things. Sunsets, boats, boat races, sunrises. So check her out. She's really cool, very connecting channel. Like, share, comment, let her know that we sent you by. Have a good day. Go, Mr. Joe.
All right, it's Joe from the Bud Files, the Bearded Historian. We are going to have a little fun today.
Uh-oh.
Today there will be a quiz. Just kidding. Going to talk about myths in South Dakota a little bit. Western South Dakota.
I honestly didn't know we had any, other than Native American ones, obviously.
Yeah. Well, some of these, you know, you got to look at the whole question, and then you got to look at the whole answer, because some of these are going to obviously raise a few eyebrows. One of the first ones that they like to take and throw into the media was the idea that mining forced open the Sioux Reservation. Now, granted, by treaty, Western South Dakota was supposed to be set up for the Great Sioux Reservation, as by Laramie Treaty, 1868. Now, a couple interesting things about it. First of all, is that we already knew that there was gold in Western South Dakota, in the Black Hills. They had talked with Father de Smet about, you know, we know this is in here. And he pretty much exclusively told them outright, whatever you do, do not tell this to any of the other white men. Now, they've had cases where there was one fellow who had a plate that was found. Ezra Kind reported that he was on his way out. His party was completely wiped out, and the gold was taken from them. Now, at the same time, they never found Ezra Kind. They never found out what happened to his stash. But it basically put into work what wound up becoming the Custer Expedition in 1874. This was that famous expedition that started out at Fort Abraham Lincoln in North Dakota. They came down, they did several searches, they did find gold, and like every other gold-hungry person in America at the time, they simply turned around and sent it out to the media. Now, what wound up happening is that all of these people decided that they were going to try and make it rich. Now, the main reason why I look at this as a myth is because at the time, there was people that were told the military is going to keep the miners out. They were under orders to keep the miners out. Camp Crook, the guy that it was named after, that was one of his jobs, was to try to go around and kick miners out. The party that wound up settling over by Custer, South Dakota, he actually escorted them back out again. Of course, then they turned around and went right back in. Now, to this side, I do believe the military, you know, their biggest problem they had was that they were not properly, you know, they didn't have the manpower to try and keep everybody out of the Black Hills.
I don't think there's any way. There's too many ways into the hills.
Yeah, because, I mean, if you look at the map of South Dakota, I'll have Sue put one up. At the time, you know, you had people that were coming up from Cheyenne, Wyoming, or present-day Cheyenne, Wyoming. You had people that were basically lining up along the Missouri River, waiting, looking. They were hoping the government would be able to convince the Native Americans, hey, you know, we want to just get a few ideas on how to get in here, get a few ideas on how we can settle this, make it profitable for both sides. Interestingly enough, also I read that the Lakota had a deal for one of the railroads to go from Chamberlain through. And they were paid X number per mile of transit. But all in all, had the United States done the honorable thing, maybe they could have increased the number of supplies of troops. Just maybe. Although, at the same time, it makes me wonder what was in their Sam Hill mind about sending an exploration group in the first place. Another item that'll come up in a later question. Now, second truth that we have that's kind of fun. Everyone who came to South Dakota was after gold. It's one of the biggest myths. Because actually, the gold rush that happened with the Black Hills, contrary to popular belief, was not huge. A lot of them came looking for the placer minings, going through the creeks, trying to find the little nuggets of gold dust and all that good stuff, the stuff that they showed in the Hollywood movies. Surprisingly enough, once that petered out, and once the roadways were opened up and the land was secured, a lot of the people that came here were looking for land. They came because there was farmland for a really good price. They were coming from places that were just overcrowded, like western, over the eastern side of the state. What's really funny is if you ever get a chance to look at an old map, say about 1870.
I'll see if I can find one.
Eastern South Dakota looks like a stitched blanket because there's all these roads, all these intersections, all this farmland. It's all divided up. It looks like a great big chessboard. But then you look at the western side of South Dakota. Very few, if any, thing exists because this, again, was all, the Great Sioux Reservation. But once 1874 happened, and the decision was made about 1878 to open up 3 roadways. One came out of Bismarck, because at that time it was just Dakota, not north, not south. They had a line going from Bismarck to Deadwood. They had a roadway going from Fort Pierre to Deadwood. And they were going to build a third one that would start at Sidney, and eventually it wound up coming up all the way to Chamberlain, going up to Deadwood. These 3 were openings that people that were looking for land, they were looking for ranching opportunities, they were looking to sell stuff to miners. Rapid City was founded in 1876. Of course, that was also the same year that Custer met the Great Beyond, but beside the point. But once everything was settled down and the options to start actually settling, there was a pretty good flow of people that were like, come on out here and get your free, 160 acres, 80 acres, 40 acres, all depending on how big of a property they wanted to go for. They would build a 11 by 14 foot shack. They would settle on it. They would set up a claim. And then if they managed to make it work for 5 years, it was free and clear to them. And because of all these people that were moving into the area, some of these small towns would actually almost bloom like overnight. They have places in, little tiny areas next to creeks. Some places, again, were right off the trails and roadways that, had just recently been built. And then, of course, when the railroads came through, places almost waited for the railroads would populate overnight. Some would be watering stations, some would carry gravel, and other places would just be drop-off points for people to start from. Midland was a good example. Phillip was a good example. Wasta, I found out, had quite a habit of dropping off up to 200 people at a time. Let them wander around, see if they liked anything, and then, in the morning, if they decided that it just wasn't for them, they'd get right back on the train and head back out to Sioux Falls. But Next up, you know, people who wanted to mine only had the Black Hills to strike it rich. For us historians, this is one of the biggest jokes. Because before the Black Hills was ever the big strike point, there was actually a gold rush in Montana. And they were actually sending ships, great big stern wheelers, up the Missouri River. Yes, before we had the dams, the Missouri River was our highway. People would come up and go over, and of course, this is where they also ran into a little bit of a problem with one of the Native American hierarchy, is that they didn't care much for our ships cutting down the trees to basically serve as fuel for the ferries and stuff. But they had people that would go up there, and they would mine, and they would work the rocks to try to find valuable minerals. You also want to think about California had a gold rush, and later on you had gold rushes in Alaska and even in the Yukon. So there were a lot of options. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about how the gold rushes worked in the Black Hills, they got to a point where a lot of the placer workings wasn't worth their time anymore. And that's when you started having events like the Homestake, or you would have these big strip mine efforts that would come through. I know of two strip mine efforts that one is still presently working, which would be the wharf, which we've seen the big hole in the, out by where Terry used to be, up by Richmond Hill area. You can pretty much see it with the Google Earth. It's a great big gray slash in the middle of the Black Hills. There's a second one called the Gilt Edge down by Galena. That one is now what we call a Superfund site because they're trying to clean up the mess that the Canadians left us with. Thanks, Canada. But, everybody talks about how all these people were coming to the Black Hills. By the time about 1910, 1912, a lot of the claims were down to maybe 4 or 5 companies, and that's it. Also, the big thing that a lot of people didn't realize is that with the Black Hills, it wasn't just gold that people were finding a discovery in. They would find things with like silver. They would find tin. They would find strikes on beryllium. They would find all sorts of unique chemicals and compositions. Of course, at the same time, your biggest problem that you would have with some of these mining operations is that when people would find it, there wouldn't be a massive drive for it. When you think about some of the elements that are starting to become curious about down in the southern hills, I know that there's a big mining company that wants to go down and work south of Custer. They haven't mined for some of these things like gypsum and stuff in decades. And so it makes me wonder if the state, which now has a lot more restriction on what can be mined, would even approve them trying to do a mining project of over 3,400 claims. That's a lot of property. But at the same time, I think what'll become interesting is to see how many people are going to throw a fit over them trying to tear up a whole bunch of forestry area down by Custer. I think they will. Now, next item that we're going to look at is, talking about farming and the crops in western South Dakota. Now, I will say that depending on the season and the year, there were times we had absolutely fantastic crops. I remember reading one time that they had cotton growing up in Dewey County because, they had really great rain, they had excellent soil compositions, wheat was growing fantastically, your hay, you get 3-4 cuttings out of it. It was just an awesome time. And that worked for about 4 to 5 years. Well then, all of a sudden they would have a drought hit. Use the year 1906 as a good example. Between 1906 and 1908, a lot of these farmers would come into the area. They would do their paperwork. They would get their, 40, 80, 160 acres, all depending on how big they wanted to try their luck at. Well, okay, so you set up in 1906, and then by 1910, you're like, oh, I've only got one more year to go. A drought would hit. And I was reading about these poor guys that, it would get so bad to the point they couldn't get moisture to get their potatoes to even sprout. They'd have to dig the potatoes back up and eat them themselves because, well, there was literally nothing they could do with the crops that they had. A little bit further on, into the 20s and 30s, this was part of the Great Dust Bowl that happened. They literally would have these brown skies. They also had issues with grasshoppers would just come through. Anything that was green, even the paint off your barn, would get stripped out. It was, just not a really pleasant time for these poor folks to try to make a go of farming. The government later on, if I remember, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt, actually wound up passing a alteration of the Homestead Act so that instead of it being 160 acres, they made it for ranching, and that upped it to 320 acres. So then they could actually make a go of it by using cattle instead of trying to raise, wheat and stuff. Of course, they also, this is about the time they started to discover part of the problem with the soils around here. I've mentioned this in the past. The eastern side of South Dakota gets double the rain. Their soil is a lot more nutrient rich, whereas over in the western side of South Dakota, you have almost this clay consistency. Now, granted, if you were able to grow grass on the area that we like to call the gumbo, it was very high in nutrients. It was really good. You just didn't want to have your cattle out on the gumbo when it started raining, or you wouldn't get your cows out of there in time.
That gumbo is dangerous.
They showed people trying to scrape this stuff off the wheels, off of your wagons, because literally it could break an axle. I wouldn't want to know what it could do to a person's leg. But, as it goes, another one of these happy little moments that they like to mention, people like to say, well, western South Dakota is an arid, dry desert with little life or value. Well, this is where it depends on what you want to put a price on. Because when you think about the western half of South Dakota, first of all, one of the number one things that all these farmers and all these people look for is water. I mean, it's one of the things that you need for life. You've got several major streams and rivers that come out of western South Dakota. Your number one, the Cheyenne River, is actually fed by one of the aquifers. And from there, you also have the northern stretch and the central, which works a lot with irrigation systems. Part of the area up there by Belfouche, you've got Belfouche, you've got Vale, you've got Nisland, you've got Newell. A lot of those areas, thanks to the irrigation works that were put in the 1920s and 30s, helped make that area one of the leading producers for things like beets, raspberries, cherries, all sorts of options that we can grow out here. And these poor people up in like North Dakota and in Wyoming are like, well, shoot, how'd they pull that one off? Well, we just had some really bright people that said, well, we're going to build these channels. You can control the water flow. And from that, all of a sudden, while these other parts of the Midwest are looking kind of brown and dead, our grazing land is now bright green and, vibrant. It's one of our bonuses. Now, it works the same way for your ranching efforts. There are some ranches here in western South Dakota. I can't even imagine what they would try to do over in the eastern side of the state because uh, if anybody wants to do a book report, look this name up. The fella's name was Ed Lemon. Okay? Lemon. Not like the lemon yellow thing.
Ah.
2 M's. But Ed was a heck of a rancher back in the day. Actually grew up on the old Oregon Trail. And
I love that game. I'm just kidding.
It's a great game. Well, what wound up happening is that about the same time that the Oregon Trail basically was termed obsolete because of the railroads, him and his family would help basically set the new railway system through Nebraska up. And so what they wound up doing is they learned, not only how ranches would work, how cattle would work, he also learned the value of grazing land. Well, he had arranged a deal where he could meet with a certain Teddy Roosevelt. And with Teddy Roosevelt's help, he got permission to graze an area of western South Dakota that was larger than the size of Rhode Island. Over 884,000 acres for 5 years. So, he started raising cattle and moving cattle in and out of this area. I guess they said it was one heck of a job to fence the thing, but yeah, I could just see that. But a lot of these northern counties, you'll see it in some of our videos, it looks like there's absolutely nobody there. And guess what? There isn't. Because a lot of that out there is all grazing land now. There's one up there by Vale, just past the little town of Enterprise, that the guy has a ranch out there called the Bismarck Trail, and it's over 800,000 acres too. And the way he makes his money is that he leases out the property so anybody can bring in his cattle, be it, 1,000 head, 10,000 head. There's probably a spot out there, just back up the trucks, unload them, and let them graze for a couple months. The cattle get nice and plump, and then when they go to market, you can make some pretty good money that way. Now, beyond the ranching, and, we do get some good crops out of here. Sunflowers.
Which we've done a little short on.
We have sunflowers like you cannot imagine out here. All the way up by, Harding County, through Perkins, down through Hacken, all the way down by Custer County, down by Folsom. You'll see these huge fields. And granted, it's even better when you're seeing it in the summer when they're all bright and yellow. Right now it's just really depressing because everything's dead. But the thing is that this is how their cycle works. Some of these fields don't get harvested until the first snow. But then once they do, they go through the machines, and all you baseball fans will be ready next year when it's time to take and have your sunflower seeds for baseball games. Because guess what? They probably came out of our backyard. And, the thing that's amazing to me is you can look out there, and it might be 15, 20 miles of bright yellow sunflowers just stretching as far as the eye can see out by Quinn, over by Cottonwood. All these wide open spaces, it's a crop that not only works well, it helps the soil, it helps it develop, gets nice and, solid. And then they can also even, they have a thing called rotational, where they might let a field take and rest for a season or two, and then they'll turn around and, bring it back in a couple of years. So that way that, the soil doesn't lose all its nutrients, and we don't have another dust bowl. But then there's the third thing that's kind of one of our bright, shiny points that we like out here. Modern day is the You know, you look at the Black Hills and our tourism industry. We got a lot of neat things to look at out here, you know, from the fishing to the hiking to, you know, going out and seeing some of these, you know, immaculate sunsets. You get to see, you know, one of the highest spots in between the Rockies and Europe. You get to see, you know, deer almost every day of the week. You'll see things like foxes. You'll see bison out running loose. You get to giggle at them if they make the mistake of picking up a tourist and flipping them. But there's a lot of neat things out here in South Dakota, and you know, I think you'd have a hard time putting a value on it because there's so many different things you can do.
2 cents. 2 cents.
2 cents. Chink, chink. But you know, these are the myths and the truth that we like to spit out about South Dakota. Again, this is Joe the Bearded One. We will catch you guys next week, and have a good day.
Night night.